Hello and welcome to the Taxcast from the Tax Justice Network. I'm Naomi Fowler. Coming up later.
We needed a new economic model locally. It was obvious that we needed something new and different and radical based upon the economic crash of 2008, which affected us quite badly.
We go to the north of England for some inspiration in Preston, where we look at the Preston Model in action. This is another extended issue of the Taxcast this month. We decided it was really worth it. No time for a tax justice news roundup, but I do want to throw in that the Oecd has called on the G7 nations to raise taxes on fossil fuel companies, agribusiness and the other main drivers for climate breakdown and ecosystem collapse. They even call for transformative change and new economic models, less reliance on GDP and a review of values so that happiness is no longer associated so closely with material consumption. Very interesting. We're going to talk to John Kristensen now from the Tax Justice Network for his take on this month. OK, John, we've got the European Union elections this month and we don't know the results, obviously, at the time of recording, but one thing we can definitely say for sure, our democracies are just not properly equipped for the realities of 21st century campaigning and the digital communications era which we're all living in, making it so easy for elites and private business to channel dark money into poison and hatred, which really serves to further their interests. They can just buy up more and more online PR space or disinformation campaigns, spreading all sorts of lies and fear. And we're seeing them all coming together, these far-right parties, in a way I don't remember ever seeing in my lifetime. You know, we're talking about the French National Front and Salvini's Lega Party in Italy. There's been all sorts of funding poured into the European Union elections from places like Steve Bannon, the far right in the United States, trying to sort of reproduce the Trump phenomenon. And these parties all look like they're becoming and going to become an even more significant force in the European Parliament. The Corporate Europe Observatory has released a brilliant report on all these supposed anti-elite parties in the European Union, basically serving big business interests and their dark money and corruption scandals, personal enrichments, corporate deregulation, enabling tax evasion. Quite worrying times.
Very worrying times, and what's quite clear, I think, is that what they are attempting to do is to disrupt democracy, and in particular to disrupt democracy where democracy is moving in the direction of strengthening environmental protection, is strengthening regulation of banks and tackling tax havens. So one of the recurring themes of the radical right, these radical rightists are portraying themselves as the non-elites. And they offer the radical alternative to the elites, and they alone claim to understand the will of the people. And that's the kind of language they're using. It doesn't matter which country we look at. It could be President Trump in Washington, or Bolsonaro in Brasilia, or Orban in Budapest, or Nigel Farage in Britain. When we scrutinise what they say in public and whose interests they truly serve and who is funding their operations, it's clear that they themselves come from the elites, and their funding comes from elites, very often from very wealthy billionaires using offshore operations. When the global banking crisis hit the advanced economies in 2008, 2009, completely upended the version of reality that we'd been sold for the previous 30 years, 40 years maybe. And that version of reality was called neoliberalism. And that has shaped economics and politics for decades. The banking crisis fed an economic crisis which was made very much worse as a result of the austerity economics adopted after the banking crisis. And that in turn fed a political crisis. And that political crisis threatens the elites more than anything else. You know, the far right in Italy, it's always been there. In Germany, in France, the Front National was there for a long, very long time. Always there, but on the margins. Now the wealthy elites started to align their interests. The elites felt that their interests were more threatened than they've ever been, so they were prepared to invest heavily. Politically, of course, the wealthy elites, during the period of neoliberalism, they accumulated vast fortunes on the back of privatization, on the back of speculative trading. They invested in private equity funds. They created huge rent-seeking private monopolies. They've been avoiding tax, shifting their wealth to tax havens. And what concerned the elites most of all was the push by the European Parliament, for example, to impose proper regulation of financial markets, to impose anti-tax avoidance measures on rich individuals and on powerful companies. And that was the reality of what was happening within the European Union after 2009, 2010. They were moving in the direction of stronger banking regulation, stronger anti-tax haven measures, and these elites definitely did not want that to happen.
And that's even with it all being watered down and blocked and slowed down. And, God knows it took a long time and is taking a long time. But even that is too much for them.
Even that was too much for them. And you might remember for a while there was even an alliance of 11 countries that were supporting a financial transaction tax and so on. But yes, that died, but nonetheless, there's still a lot of public goodwill towards that, public goodwill towards imposing public registries of beneficial ownership on the tax havens. These projects were live and moving forward steadily within the European Union. They've adopted country-by-country reporting. Yes, with all the problems, it's there. They've adopted measures like automatic information exchange through the Common Reporting Standard. They've adopted a strong anti-avoidance measure. So this is like some kind of nightmare for the wealthy elites who benefit from all this, but they couldn't start pushing back against that. Well, they've tried. They've been lobbying like hell to do that. So they had to create a diversion, and they have created a massive diversion. Now, in their, I would say, revised version of reality, the economic problems of the US and Europe weren't caused by underinvestment or austerity or welfare cutbacks or by weak productivity and lack of training programs for young people and so on. No, in their version of reality, the real problems are due to immigrants and all the social changes of recent decades. These are people who, they're supporting measures to push back against gay rights. They're pushing back against civil marriages. They're pushing back against climate change activists and women's rights. So they were prepared to form alliances with these kind of really nasty people because those alliances would break up, disrupt and distract. And they offer this story about restoring social stability and return to some kind of golden age where national identities were apparently solid. And for people who find the modern age really unsettling, this is a very persuasive story. Of course, it's nonsense. We know it's nonsense. It'll get us nowhere. But that's the story that's being peddled.
Right, and if you look at the rise of the Brexit Party and the candidates there, you only have to look at the candidates' profiles to see that, the real driver behind their campaign is the City of London finance sector. This is all about capture by finance. The Byline Times recently has profiled 20 Brexit Party candidates. Among those profiled, 18 of them are company directors, 8 of them bankers, 5 of them working in derivatives and hedge funds. That tells us a lot more than what they're actually talking about. They're not talking about finance.
No, they're definitely not talking about finance, but that's what really floats their boat. That's the issue that really concerns them. But they know it doesn't concern the electorate. Quite the opposite. The electorate, by and large, is very, very hostile to tax avoidance and hostile to the speculation of the big hedge funds and so on. So, yes, thank goodness for independent journalism. Thank goodness for investigative journalism. Thank goodness for those media which haven't been totally captured by the billionaires. As you say, Brexit campaign in Britain headed by financiers, funded by financiers. When they talk about cutting red tape and bureaucracy, what they're really talking about here is cutting social protections, cutting workers' rights, reducing consumer protections and pushing back against environmental protection measures. But they're not going to be saying that publicly. They'll be talking about immigrants and taking back control and all sorts of vague things, rotting the fabric of democracy from within.
And as always, transparency is the key.
Yep.
Okay, let's talk about Huawei now. There's been all sorts of things happening around this Chinese communications company, and we can't discuss it all, but the story was leaked not very long ago in the UK that Prime Minister May was ignoring her cabinet colleagues and security advisors, and she wanted to award a contract for that company to roll out Britain's new 5G infrastructure. And that's something the United States has condemned, as well as her own security services. The United States said because of the security and surveillance risks from the Chinese, which is kind of ironic considering the US's own history in that area. But anyway, we've seen before, haven't we, how the British government is totally willing to ignore security risks in order to gain Chinese business. I'm thinking of the nuclear power station contracting a few years ago, where Britain signed a really disadvantageous deal, wherein it invited companies controlled by the Chinese Communist Party, and in one case the Chinese military, into the heart of the UK's energy infrastructure. And that nuclear deal between Britain and China went against the advice of the security services, the military, the US government, and Chinese infrastructure investment in the UK was a deal that was struck in exchange, really, for boosting London's role as an offshore trading centre for the renminbi. And in this period that we're in now, Britain's supposed to be leaving the European Union. They're basically desperate to be waving around new, independently made trading deals, outside the European Union. But leaving all of that aside, maybe the most interesting question, the most important question we should be answering is, why doesn't Britain have its own Huawei?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and that's a question which I think is at root, built around Britain's finance curse, the way the finance curse has completely shaped Britain's development strategy in the last 20, 30 years, and now leaves Britain with very, very few development options other than to look to powerful external investors, including the Chinese, to invest in the next generation. The national security specialists are, of course, they're absolutely right to flag up concerns about the possibility of foreign agencies hoovering up data from phone calls and internet traffic and using that data for all kinds of nefarious purposes, including subverting democracy. Now, thanks to WikiLeaks and Edward Snowden, we know that Facebook and similar, they've been harvesting data and passing it on to analysts who've used that data to manipulate elections, not just in Britain, but across the world. So it's quite clear that foreign agencies are up to their eyeballs in collecting data and misusing it.
All of them.
All of them, yes. Huawei is regarded as a particular concern because it has very close links to the Chinese government and to the Chinese military. So the concerns are understandable. However, and this goes back to your prime question, there's no disputing that Huawei currently leads the world in the area of 5G technology, and there's also no disputing that UK technology companies are nowhere to be seen in this field. In the 1980s, Britain adopted this development path, which was, we all know, very neoliberal. Mrs. Thatcher was pushing for opening up of markets, in particular opening up Britain's markets to foreign capital. So everything, including banks and water companies, power suppliers, transport infrastructure, even newspapers and television companies were sold off to foreign investors and turned into cash cow generators for those foreign investors. So you had a situation where natural monopolies like water supply or railways were privatised, but once in private ownership, actually found themselves being bought up by foreign state-owned companies which simply ran them as income sources for their own operations in their own home countries. This is where the ideology became totally crazy. Now, the true believers in free market policies of Margaret Thatcher, they thought that encouraging private companies to invest in research and development would lead to them becoming world leaders. And this, quite simply, never happened. Instead, the big financiers, the banks and so on, they moved in. The hedge funds, the private equity people, they asset stripped the companies entirely, or they closed them down, or in the case of private equity companies, they bought up profitable businesses, they stripped out all the intellectual property rights and many of the assets and sold them off to offshore companies. They burdened them with massive debt leverage, all of which allowed them to shift astonishing amounts of profits to offshore subsidiaries based in tax havens. And very little, if any, of those huge profits were ever ploughed back into new research and development. So back to Huawei, whilst Chinese government was encouraging this huge expansion of its higher education and research and development, and that led to a steady increase in Chinese companies registering new patents across a very wide range of technologies. Britain steadily fell behind, reaching this point where we are now, where its investments in research and development lagged behind every other major Western competitor country. So if you want to know the real reason why Britain doesn't have a domestic version of Huawei, the answer lies in this ideological shift starting in 1979 onwards, which has led to the financialisation of the entire British economy, deindustrialisation of the vast majority of what used to be the manufacturing hinterland, and the fact is the British government has largely withdrawn from funding the kind of major research and development initiatives that ultimately feed through into the huge technology paradigm shifts.
Right, that's where we come to the idea of the entrepreneurial state, which Mariana Mazzucato wrote about so famously. Whatever you can say about China, they certainly have invested and developed.
Absolutely. This is the point about the huge technology shifts, as we're seeing, for example, in the move to 5G in the telecoms market, is that it requires a massive amount of investment in research and development, very high risk, and that's where the entrepreneurial state comes in, because it funds the university research programs and so on, which makes these huge shifts possible. Britain still has some entrepreneurs who are developing slightly better vacuum cleaners and making fortunes out of that. But, it's not a gigantic paradigm shift that are needed and which require huge state investment to make the new technologies practicable.
Thanks, John. John Kristensen of the Tax Justice Network. Now it's time for the Taxcast special feature. We've talked many times on the Taxcast about the finance curse and how it sucks the life out of innovation and investment in the productive economy, how it's all about wealth extraction, not wealth creation, and it's definitely not about tax justice. Even without the problems the City of London's oversized finance sector causes for the British economy, it's like many capital cities around the world. It gets the lion's share of investment and public funding, a bit like the Rust Belt in the United States. The north of England and the Midlands, where I'm from, were hit the hardest by deindustrialisation. And in Britain, just like the Rust Belt states, there's been a long history of political indifference and neglect by central government. There's been no visionary investment and proper action to help redevelop those regions. And then to make things worse, there was the banking crisis and the recession in 2008, and that was followed by austerity. Cuts which were levied disproportionately on already depressed and investment-starved towns and cities and already struggling people. So in that destructive climate of shareholder capitalism, crony capitalism and corporate welfare, many are now looking for a different way to transform their local economies for local benefit. And it's working. This month, the Taxcast is in Preston in the north of England, which just won an award for Britain's most improved city. We're here to look at the Preston Model.
Bars popped up, and people are drinking this stuff now and appreciating the taste more. That's a local one, that's Preston North End. That we've got very pale ales. This is a pale, this is a golden one, that's a pale ale.
Oh, you've got one called Flat Cap.
Yeah, exactly.
That's very northern.
Yeah, exactly. There's one here. He's named him after his children. Born Idle, Big Girl's Blouse, Scoundrel, and a bit more worryingly, Arsonist.
Arsonist.
Yeah, exactly. That is a bit worrying.
This is Billy in Preston's Covered Market. He's selling speciality beers brewed in the north of England.
I applied for 200 jobs in a month and a half, something like that, and I got one reply, and that was it. And it was so demoralising. And so what I did, I set up a page on Facebook. I got 3,500 members on that page now, and I set that up because I wanted a job. But on the page today, I got a text message earlier about a job in Chorley. I don't want to do it, it's labouring. So I just messaged this lad, I said, look, there's a job here, if you want it, go for it, sort of thing. So I tried to help him. People try and help each other.
What do you think about the Preston model then?
The model that they're trying to do. I think that if we didn't do it ourselves, nobody would help us. So I'm proud of Preston anyway, it's me. But what I am proud of is the way we're trying to help each other, and I believe in that 100%.
We needed a new economic model locally, especially with the economic crash and how that affected Preston, because a lot of the inward investment, big developer-led investment, didn't materialise. It was obvious that we needed something new and different and radical based upon the economic crash of 2008, which affected us quite badly.
This is Preston City Council leader Matthew Brown, elected to serve Preston for the Labour Party.
And then also we had central government cutting our budget. So our overall budget has gone down from 30 odd million to 20 odd million. So we've lost about a third of it. That's
been government policy for years now. Apparently by next year, 2020, councils or local government across the country in a decade will have lost 60% of the money the central government used to provide to spend on local services. Soon, 168 councils will no longer receive any revenue support at all. Many are on the verge of bankruptcy. With so little money coming from central government, how do you address inequality and poverty? How do you boost your local economy? Back to where we are in Preston. In 2012 to 2013, a study by the Centre for Local Economic Strategies showed that 6 Preston institutions, including the local university, had a combined spending power of nearly £750 million a year, not far off $1 billion. When they looked at their top 300 suppliers, only 5% of that money was being spent with organisations and businesses based in Preston, and only just under half of it was spent with what's classed as small and medium-sized enterprises. So only £1 for every £20 they were spending was actually staying in Preston. Much of the rest of that was going to huge construction firms and others, usually headquartered in London. And so here in Preston, this small local council changed how it spent the little money it had. They refocused their spending, their procurement of public goods and services, keeping it close to home. Let's get back to Preston City Council leader Matthew Brown.
A lot of this procurement has actually gone back to locally based businesses, and the exciting part is that there's so many gaps which are going to mainly large companies that are headquartered in Greater London and the South East, and I'm sure a lot of this public wealth may end up somewhere in a tax arrangement overseas. So it's there obviously encouraging local businesses, but also we want to create a number of worker-owned businesses potentially to provide those goods and services and compete. So you're getting that virtuous cycle of keeping wealth within the community and democratising the wealth as well, and democratising the economy. For example, establishing our own bank and looking at the wealth fund and looking at setting up some company potentially to provide affordable housing again with the council, actually bringing that democracy back. And we're bringing that democracy back into the other institutions that are embracing this as well.
I want to ask you about procurement and how free you are as a council to set your standards of what you think is acceptable for a company. For example, if you're keeping it local, can you set standards such as, without any legal challenges or anything like that, by saying, okay, it has to be a company within 50 miles, it has to pay the living wage, it has to declare its taxes publicly, just as examples. How free are you to set those standards?
It's there that we are getting these standards in through social value, weighting contracts and giving companies that do these things a bit more of an advantage, but also there's other things you can do, like breaking contracts down into lots, because the European thresholds for works, I think it's about £4 million, for services about 200,000. And within that, under that threshold, there are lots of contracts which can really encourage local companies to bid for. But obviously, the price and the quality must be good. You know, we're not giving it to inferior companies locally that are providing less of a good service. I mean, this has been done all within the regulations, European regulations and the UK regulations, and there's not been any extra price or loss of quality. It's been very positive, and what we're finding is the local businesses tend to really go out of their way to do the things we want them to do, so they're more likely to pay the real living wage or help people who are in hard to reach groups or have staff volunteering. So it has been very positive. And interestingly, if you do things like break the contracts down into smaller bits, which makes it easier for local companies to compete, often the larger companies, for some reason, they just don't show interest in it. But the reality is that for every pound that goes to a small business, 63p stays in the local economy. If it goes to a large business or a multinational business, it's only 40p. So in many ways, there are actually less jobs if it goes to organisations like that. Now, obviously, we can't exclude them. It's got to be through fair and open competition. But sometimes you've got to have a bit of courage and say, well, we want to support certain forms of enterprise, which we do know have a strong evidence base, will create more jobs and make sure that there's less inequality in our local economy. And I think we've got a duty to do that. So this movement towards community wealth building, it's becoming quite a global movement now. And I mean, procurement is just one of few things that we actually have left where we can actually make an influence.
Yeah, because a lot of power's been taken away, hasn't they, from local councils.
So all these ideas put together, we feel are quite transformative and have really helped us achieve a lot, because the amount of employees within the Preston local economy, it's gone from 55,000 to 70,000 just in 3 years. And the level of self-employment is less than half the national average, so people have employment contracts. So say, for example, construction, there must be tens of millions which through the public sector, including ourselves, has gone to locally based construction companies. And if they as family-owned companies win contracts, I mean, I think some of them have 100 employees, others about 300. The subcontractual arrangements, there's dozens, if not hundreds, of locally based suppliers that are actually, it's filtering through to them. So we feel that's had a big impact in the amount of jobs that we have. And real living wage. So again, that's coming into a lot of the purchasing decisions, as well as when people are directly employed. So the statistics are pretty good in the sense, if you look at jobs, if you look at wage levels, we're now the best area in Lancashire for people receiving at least £9 an hour for people who work here.
There are many policies they're implementing here in Preston that go beyond procurement to local companies. And at the Tax Justice Network, we know how hard it is for businesses to get credit from banks, which are more interested in churning and financialisation than lending to proper businesses these days. Well, in Preston, they're also working towards setting up local banks. And that's happening just as branches of all the major banks are disappearing off the high streets. We'll come back to that. Worker-owned cooperative businesses are central to Preston's development model.
I started into this back in the 80s when I was thinking about how we could change the company that I was running, which had been owned by my extended family for a long, long time.
This is David Odell, who transformed his company into a worker-owned cooperative business some years ago. He's speaking here to an audience in Glasgow.
In order to motivate youngsters on the floor, on the shop floor, all I could think of saying was, well, aren't you lucky to be working to make my family rich? And it really doesn't work. When you're at the top of a power structure, you're not very sensitive to it. You just think it's that when people say that your ideas are the best ideas, it's because they are the best ideas. Basically, the guys on the shop floor got no information at all. They couldn't influence anything. Nobody listened to their ideas. They didn't participate in any of the wealth that they were creating. It's not a good way to live, and that's the normal situation. Some people say that you don't need to have employee ownership. You can have a sense of ownership. But if you invite your friends around for lunch and you ask that they stand around and get a sense of eating lunch by watching you eating lunch, it's not going to work. In a conventional corporation, the power structure is top-down. There's this big hierarchy. Everybody's supervising each layer below, and the people at the bottom don't even get to supervise themselves. They're just told what to do. The money goes in the other direction. It gets sucked out and up into the pockets of the fat cat or the financial institutions in the city. You can see the effect that that's going to have on the distribution of wealth. It's going to make the rich richer. This is not a good situation. There have been a large number of studies now, particularly in the States, which confirm that employee ownership never makes a company worse and tends very consistently to produce all kinds of good effects. You don't have to be highly educated to get it. You just have to be a person, be a human being. It's just common sense that if you own the company, you're going to care about it, and you're going to care about your customers more. The top-rated childcare company in England, by a long, long way, is Childbase, which is employee-owned. In the area of Newcastle, there's a group of 5 employee-owned companies, started originally by Sunderland Home Care. Again, top-rated. They've been winning more and more and more market share because of the quality of what they do, employee-owned.
Where should we go? Just in here?
Well, if you literally near the kitchen.
Oh, right, okay.
Looks like they're tidying up, actually.
Just having a little look around the kitchen. Got a bread in the oven.
Bread in the oven.
That's local bread.
Yes.
I'm visiting Preston's first worker-owned cooperative business. I'm in a place called The Larder. It's just across the road from Preston Council.
I'm Alison. I'm a member of the co-op here that's set up the whole enterprise, and our vision is to address issues around food poverty in Preston and in the wider area, and we're doing that through various strategies. One being to set up a lovely cafe in the town centre, which is where we're at the moment, literally in the kitchen, which is where I always feel comfortable. And that's our public front. But in addition to that, we are running a training academy, offering accredited and non-accredited training to people who are unemployed or are struggling in sort of more deprived circumstances, experiencing food poverty quite possibly. And we're able to offer training here in the cafe and offer work experience in the kitchen and in the front of house in the cafe itself. Additionally, we are looking at the whole question around food procurement and how that happens locally, and we're looking at the supply chains and how we can bring local food growers and producers very much more sort of into direct contact with consumers.
So as we came in, we've just had a cup of tea and some very nice soup and the local bread, and a whole group of Syrian women were just leaving, having just got their hygiene health certification, I think, and so I guess they're ready to go out into the workplace with their accreditation.
Exactly right, yes. It's actually a 2-day course, and they've got a level 2 accredited food hygiene certificate as a result of that. So yes, they hopefully, and we'll follow them through, but yes, they're out there now with this qualification, able maybe to set up their own small businesses or to find employment in the city.
That, in essence, is what we're doing. So giving people an opportunity to gain employment and look at using food as a vehicle for change.
I'm speaking to the Larder's Kay Johnson. So you're trying to develop links with local farmers, trying to source things that are grown locally and organically.
We're doing well at it. Yeah. Mm. I mean, we've got, at the moment, if you look in there, we've got our supplier of the week. So our first supplier of the week. Show me.
Come
and have a look. So this is Joe Brown, and Joe supplies our eggs. He's autistic, and he wants to set up a business, and he wants to help other people set up businesses. And so he's got an egg round, and he buys his eggs from a free-range farm nearby, and he sells them. So we buy them from him because we want to support not only the farm that he buys from, but also him because he's a small business person. We buy our bread locally from a guy called John, who's set up a bakery in his own garage because he's got a disabled son that he cares for, and he can look after his son and work from home. I'm about to get our minced lamb for the moussaka on Saturday from our organic farmer who's over in Burnley. So if we use meat, we only get it from him. So we are trying to make sure that everything that we buy is locally and ethically sourced, but also we want other people to, so we want to put it out there. So Joe is currently out there all over social media and the website, and we're trying to promote what he's doing. Eventually we want to have our own procurement enterprise where we can give organisations an opportunity to buy locally from small farmers and producers across Lancashire.
So it gets bigger and bigger and bigger.
Yeah. So this is like a little hub here, and then all of the projects can grow out from this. And I taught in prisons for a few years, and it was really disheartening seeing guys that I thought could have flourished if they'd been given the right opportunity. So we want to be able to give ex-offenders an opportunity to get accredited qualifications and work experience. So we're working with 6 ex-offenders at the moment, and then we'll be looking to offer them work experience once they've completed their qualifications. People come in and work. We've got groups that meet here. We've got some veterans that come for the breakfast on a Saturday morning. Yeah, it's lovely. We've got women in business groups and all sorts of people that just want to come and enjoy the space.
It's very different to a Costa's or a Cafe Nero or a Starbucks.
Yeah, well, we want people to embrace the concept of what we're doing, that what we want them to know is that when they come here that their money is well spent. So every penny that they spend with us is spent wisely. Our staff are paid the real living wage. All of our producers are paid a fair price for what we're buying from them. And any profit or excess that we make will go to fund the work that we do in the community. We love it.
Alison Watts and Kay Johnson in Preston's first worker-owned cooperative, The Larder. Back to Matthew Brown again, across the road in the Preston Council offices. Those are near Preston's Victorian wrought iron covered market, which has been restored. Can I just ask you about the covered market, because I know that was a big project. It was £4 million. Lots of other councils might have gone to Carillion or some other big construction company, and as you say, a lot of that money would have gone back down south out of the local economy and many other problems besides. But Preston just went completely the other way. Can you explain a bit about how that worked, what you did there?
Yeah, I mean, we did have a consensus about we wanted a local company to be successful within the rules, and we obviously made the companies aware of that. We had 3 bids, that's my understanding, and they're all local companies. And I think about 100 people on site. And again, through the subcontractual arrangement, there were local people as well. So I think there's at least 80%, probably 90% of the new market was built by locally based suppliers. Fantastic. It was all very good. And I think people like it. And then obviously all the companies within the new market, they're independent businesses, so they're owned by people who live here. So it's very positive.
How long have you had this stall here? 'Cause you're selling jewellery, medals, all sorts.
Clothing, a year.
So you've been here a year.
Yeah.
And how long do you have to commit to having a stall
3
here?
years.
You have to commit for 3 years.
I wanted 3 years.
Right.
I wasn't going to set up all this for less than for a year. That would be no good. I wanted 3 years and let me have 3 years.
And what's the difference in setting up a stall here to having a shop, actually moving into a shop?
More exciting because you're inside and outside.
Is it cheaper as well? I mean, it must be.
Oh, definitely. It's
cheaper
definitely cheaper
for you,
than,
so your
than having a
overheads
shop.
are lower.
Yeah, it would be a lot
So
cheaper.
you're
I've not had a
better
shop
money.
before, but I've always been on the market or doing car boots and travelling around. But this is perfect. It's lovely. It's brilliant.
It's sociable, isn't it?
Oh gosh, yeah, it's lovely. And I get, meeting nice people like you two as well. Yeah, you meet a lot of different people.
We think it's amazing that they built this market. Apparently they got £4 million and they redid it because it did need some work, and it's beautiful now, it's all Victorian wrought iron and all this stuff. It looks really nice. Instead of getting some great big company, they got all local people paying a living wage.
That's it, yes. Yeah, that was a good idea as well, yeah. Yeah, using the local people for doing all the local work. Yeah, they've done such a lovely job of it.
Yeah. Apparently they were telling me you can rent a stall in this market just for one afternoon if you want to.
I think it's from about £5.
If someone was just starting up, like you've been doing this for a long time, so you've got the experience, but if someone doesn't have that experience, it's a really nice way, an easy way in. Oh, so you started like that? I
started in that corner there on a Saturday morning. Then I got my trader's licence and insurance and all that. Yeah,
so how long have you been in this market, trading in this market?
About 8 years on and off. Yeah, brilliant. Good. Very, very good. Yes, really, really enjoy it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes.
Good luck with everything.
Thank you very much.
Preston's lovely covered market. Going back to employee-owned cooperative businesses, Preston is following in the footsteps of some very, very successful initiatives elsewhere in the world. Here's David Odell again, the owner who turned his business into an employee-owned cooperative.
The Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao was built by an employee-owned company, part of the Mondragon Group, which employs 100,000 people around the world. It was inspired by a priest who always remained the local priest. The first one was started in 1956. Then it was very successful very quickly, and so they started another one, and another one. And then by 1959, they were growing very, very fast, which a lot of people say employee-owned companies won't do, but they do. And the banks panicked, and they said, these are just a bunch of workers. Who's going to actually make sure that they repay the money we're lending them? So they stopped the money. So these country folk really came to the priest and said, we've run out of money. What are we going to do? Nobody will give us any money. So he said, well, banks have money. Why don't you start a bank? And they all stormed out. They said, we are country folk. You've got us running companies already, and now you want us to be bankers. It's ridiculous. So a few weeks later, he turned up with a sheaf of papers at one of their meetings, and he said, there you are, you're all directors of a bank. And that bank went on to fund the development of 120 different companies, new companies, all started from scratch, and they never had a failure. And they're all employee-owned, and they're all completely democratic, and they work in a network. Each one is independent, autonomous. And they've got serious businesses. I mean, the group of worker cooperatives that does automotive supply is the 4th largest in Europe, the 2nd largest luxury coach manufacturer, the 3rd largest retailer in Spain, and so on. So they're very serious businesses. And all of that growth was funded by working with the bank.
And that's just where Preston's aiming for. And the signs are that it's getting there. Matthew Brown.
The best way to protect services, in my opinion, is to actually create new institutions like a local bank that can lend to local businesses. It'll create jobs and people will pay the taxes. We want to head towards a situation like we are, like Mondragon or Emilia Romagna in Italy, or have a banking system similar to North Dakota and Germany, where we can feel we've done something that's really transformative, and that is actually an alternative to capitalist organisation at a local and regional level. But all these things, they do take time, they take collaboration. Obviously, you've still got to win lots of hearts and minds for these ideas.
And Preston Council is partnering with Mondragon, among others, to invest in and incubate 10 more employee-owned cooperatives with a project called In Cash and In Kind.
It's just over £500,000, and potentially we've got an investment fund which we can utilise as well if needed, of another £500,000, which is supporting us expanding the cooperative economy. And very interestingly, there's a similar project in New York City at the same time. So in the Bronx, there's going to be a push towards having more worker-owned firms there. So it's extremely exciting, and obviously the university with its business skill are involved in that as well. But the other partner is Mondragon Cooperative Corporation. So they're coming over in, I think, October for 4 months, their consultancy service, and they're going to help people incubate these firms. So that's what's going to be happening. The links with Mondragon are fantastic, because if you look at their success, 15 billion euros, the largest business, I believe, in that region of Spain. And then even things like life expectancy for people who work within those companies through their lives being 2 or 3 years better than traditional shareholder-owned companies. It's really amazing, and especially the wage levels that they get, and the fact there's a 1 in 6 ratio between top and bottom.
Right, and that 1 in 6 ratio between top and bottom that you're talking about means the head of the company earns no more than 6 times what their lowest paid employee earns.
Yeah, on top of that as well, we're very soon looking to form a mutual company to incubate the Northwest Regional Bank with the Community Savings Banking Association. So over the next 2 years we'll have that going on, but then by the end of that we should hopefully have a Northwest Community Bank, which will be the first cooperative customer-owned banks in the UK. The reality is that the large banks are withdrawing from our high street. There's not much of a physical presence. There's a difficulty often for local businesses to access finance. There's also the fact a lot of local businesses put the money in the larger banks, and if it's a cafe or another kind of business, and again that wealth leaves the area. So the idea about this is we create an alternative, and it's envisaged it'll lend across the northwest. So we're looking at Lancashire, Cumbria, and Merseyside, 3 million people, £500 million. And that is a very cautious modelling of 2% switching to this bank within that region. Now, if it was 10%, it would be £5 billion. So can you see how you can taking back control in a really positive way? And again, this bank also may potentially be able to lend to the cooperative economy, especially where there are these economic gaps, because there's tens, if not hundreds of millions that's leaking out of Lancashire, really, where we could create cooperative businesses as an alternative.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely know, and at the Tax Justice Network, this big problem about business and investment and finance and accessing it.
Here in Preston, it's reckoned there's 24 branches which have disappeared, both in Preston and surrounding areas of, say, 10 miles. And that's really important, because if you're a small business that wants to actually deposit money at the end of the day, you know, it's really difficult, especially if you don't have a car or anything like that. So again, there's that wealth extraction, that straitjacket that we're in many ways, which we want to tackle, but it's by offering an alternative, you know, and let's compete with the big banks. And I think they might be a bit scared, really, because if people get educated, I think we could really create some kind of really strong movement.
Well, I came to Preston to be inspired, and I certainly was, thanks to everyone I spoke to there. So, there are alternative development strategies that serve all our interests, and they work well. And there are plenty more ideas working well that I haven't covered here. I'm looking forward to going back to Preston soon and see how they're doing. That's it for this month. Thanks for listening. We'll be back next month with coverage of the Tax Justice Network's brand new Corporate Tax Haven Index. Bye for now.